Barron Trump tried to publicly challenge Representative Jasmine Crockett on live TV. What he got instead was a brutal, calm reality check that left him rethinking everything. The camera caught it all. The air in the auditorium wasn't heavy, just expectant. Like everyone knew something off-script was about to happen, but didn't know from where. When Barron Trump stepped up to the mic, there was a stir, not because of his name, though that always brought some weight, but because of the way he carried himself. Shoulders squared, voice steady, he wasn't here to fumble. Or so he thought. The town hall was live broadcast coast to coast. A panel of lawmakers and youth leaders lined the stage inside the Gerald Ford Civic Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat third from the left. She was dressed sharp with a stare that could read through bravado. She didn't lean back. She didn't smile much. She listened. Barron was 18, newly graduated, and recently thrust into a conservative youth spotlight. His team had briefed him, "Well, speak strong, don't get rattled, stick the landing." He cleared his throat, looked straight at Crockett, and said, "Congresswoman Crockett, I've followed some of your past legal cases and public commentary. It's hard to take certain people seriously. When they use outrage as a career move, the room shifted, not a gasp, just that quick silence when people stop blinking." She didn't flinch, not once. There was no quick-fire rebuttal, no performance. Crockett simply tilted her head a little, like she'd heard this 100 times before, just never from someone so young and so sure. "Mr. Trump," she began her tone. "Even it's telling that the loudest voices criticizing my tone rarely have anything to say about the facts that made that tone necessary. That's when the murmur started." But she wasn't done. Her words were sharp, but they didn't cut to wound. They cut to open. She talked about the girls she represented in court, who had no media team, no family name, no safety net. She brought up a 12-year-old client she defended in Dallas, who had been suspended for talking back to a teacher, only to later find out that teacher had been recorded mocking the student's dialect. She recounted how outrage wasn't a career move. It was survival. You call it outrage. I call it using the tools I have to defend those who have none. And you, standing where you are, should be asking why so many people still need defending. Barron blinked. This wasn't the exchange he'd practiced for. He tried to respond. "I'm just saying." But she interrupted without raising her voice. "No, you're not just saying, you're performing. And, unfortunately for you, I don't give out standing ovations for weak scripts. The audience didn't erupt. That would have cheapened it. Instead, they sat stunned, watching a boy with a famous last name get humbled. Not by insults, but by intelligence wrapped in restraint. The moment traveled fast. By the time the segment ended, clips had already hit Twitter, TikTok, and every group chat that lived for political drama. The headlines wrote themselves, but they missed the nuance. This wasn't about dunking. It wasn't about dominance. It was about what happens when someone used to control walks into a space where that name doesn't protect them because Crocker didn't attack him. She exposed the thinness of his argument without once turning mean. That's what stung the most. She stayed calm, poised, precise, and somewhere in the middle of her response, Barron's expression cracked. His eyebrows dipped, his mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to interject. But what could he say? He wasn't talking to a pundit. He was talking to a woman who'd been elbow-deep in systems that didn't care about names, who fought uphill for years without cameras. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. But the story didn't start there. And it definitely didn't end there. It wasn't random. This wasn't one of those fluke encounters that happen in airport lounges or green rooms backstage. The town hall had been in the works for months, officially billed as Voices of Tomorrow, a national youth policy forum. It aimed to bridge the growing gap between Gen Z and Washington. It was meant to look fresh, feel urgent, and most importantly, get eyes. The producers at C-SPAN knew what they were doing. They wanted headlines, sure, but more than that, they wanted something raw, something that didn't look prepackaged, so they did what they thought would create sparks. They built a panel of high-profile lawmakers and invited hand-picked Gen Z speakers to challenge them. That's how Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett got involved. Outspoken, direct, sharp, a former public defender turned lawmaker out of Texas. She'd made a name for herself by refusing to play it safe. Her supporters loved her for that. Her critics hated her for the exact same reason. And then there was Barron Trump. His invitation was controversial from the start. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even in college yet, but he'd started making media rounds since turning 18, podcasts, live streams, speaking engagements at conservative youth conferences behind closed doors. Some producers thought it was a risk, but to others, that name was golden. It guaranteed eyeballs. The pitch was simple. Put him on stage as a voice of young conservatism. He agreed reportedly against the advice of a few family insiders. They warned him that policy forums weren't rallies, but Barron was confident. Maybe too confident he'd grown up in rooms where most people nodded before he even finished speaking. That's not how things worked in this room. The forum was held in Grand Rapids, but it wasn't limited to Michigan issues. Questions ranged from climate policy to free speech, digital privacy to criminal justice reform. There were 4 politicians was fielding most of the heat, and it was clear early on she wasn't ducking anything. Barron's moment came about halfway through the program, but before that, he'd already been posturing a bit, scribbling notes, whispering to a handler seated behind him, glancing toward the camera between responses. If you were paying attention, you could tell he had something planned. The young man sitting next to him, Elijah Moreno, a 19-year-old student organizer from Fresno, tried to whisper something to Barron. During a commercial break, something about easing up and letting the conversation flow. Barron waved him off. "I got this," he said. Cameras didn't catch that part, but a few audience members later confirmed it. Meanwhile, Crockett was holding her ground. With precision, when asked about the tension between police unions and reform advocates, she didn't pander. She talked about contracts. She talked about civilian review boards. She didn't play to the camera. She played to the facts Barron had been watching. Waiting, he wasn't brought in as a disruptor, but that's what he decided to be. Whether it was pride pressure or plain performance, no one knows. But when he took the mic and aimed directly at her, he didn't ask a question. He gave a speech, a short one but laced with condescension. He mentioned her track record of outrage, accused her of being louder than effective, and questioned how her legal background translated to real policy. It wasn't subtle. It was built for social media clips, short, sharp, provocative. The room didn't boo, but something changed. Crockett sat still. Her expression didn't flicker. She waited for him to finish in that silence. Something important happened. It became clear, at least to the viewers at home, that this wasn't 2 equals trading views. This was a young man trying to throw a punch with his father's shadow behind him, and a woman who'd been in too many real fights to flinch. But what came next wasn't a political rebuttal. It was something far more calculated. He knew the moment was his. The cameras had already started tightening their frame around him. The moderator gave a small nod. Barron adjusted his jacket sleeve like he'd seen his father do. 1,000 times on stage. Then he stepped forward. He didn't stumble. That much was clear. His voice was calm, steady, almost rehearsed. And maybe it was because as soon as he began to speak, it sounded less like a question and more like a monologue meant for viral replay. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "I've read your record. I followed your legal work and your time in Congress. But don't you think there's a difference between fighting for justice and being addicted to conflict? Sometimes it feels like you're more interested in being loud than being right." He paused for effect, letting the words hang. That was the moment his team had probably told him to aim for the viral soundbite, the clip that would get shared in conservative circles. The words themselves weren't groundbreaking, but the delivery, the smirk, the posture, the slow blink afterward told everyone he thought he'd just won, except he hadn't. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond right away. She didn't lean back or reach for a microphone. Like she was on a panel show, she just looked at him, really looked at him. If you were in the room, you felt it. Not rage, not embarrassment, just something heavier, disappointment. The kind of look a teacher gives a student who chose to show off instead of show up prepared. She leaned slightly forward. "Barron," she began. "No title, no formalities. Just the name. The problem with speaking, before you've lived, is that you confuse volume with vision." There it was no shouting, no name calling, just facts, dressed as lessons. He tried to respond quickly, tried to catch her off guard, but she wasn't done. "You think this is about being loud? Let me tell you something," she said, keeping her voice, even her eyes locked on his. "When I was practicing law, I sat across from judges who told black girls they were too emotional when they cried after being assaulted. I've been in courtrooms where silence was used as a weapon against justice. So no, I don't quiet down to make people comfortable. He didn't say anything. Not yet. So she kept going. You've lived in a world that gives you the benefit of the doubt before you say a word. Most of the people I fight for don't even get the benefit of being heard. So when you call it outrage, I hear you're making me uncomfortable by refusing to shrink. And I'm not shrinking. Somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a single audible, not mocking, not sarcastic. Just one of those reflexes people have when truth shows up. Barron stood still. He hadn't prepared for this. His lines were tight, but they weren't deep. He looked over at the moderator, unsure if he should reply, retreat, or just stay still. The moderator didn't step in. I respect your position, Barron said finally, a little stiffer than before. But I still think tone matters in public service. That's when Crockett delivered the line that would be clipped and reposted for weeks. You care about tone because you don't know what it feels like to need content. No shouting, no finger pointing, just that calm, sharp rhythm. The kind of delivery that makes it past politics and lands somewhere in your gut. And in that moment, it wasn't just about him anymore. Tapped a silent rhythm against the side of the mic. Crockett stayed centered, anchored. Her voice had weight. Not because it was loud, but because it didn't try to impress. She wasn't selling anything. She was explaining a life he hadn't lived. Tone, she repeated gently, as if the word itself had missed the point. You brought up tone, but tone didn't get me through law school while working night shifts. Tone didn't help me sit with parents who just lost their child in a traffic stop. And it sure as hell didn't keep me calm when a day accused a teenage girl of acting grown because she wore lip gloss to school. Now her hands moved just slightly. One hand rested on the table in front of her. The other traced a line in the air as she made her next point. Not dramatic. Intentional tone is a tool people reach for when they don't want to deal with the substance. I'm not here to sound nice. I'm here to tell the truth. Barron didn't interrupt, whether it was respect, discomfort, or calculation. No one could be sure, but something had changed. He wasn't leaning forward anymore. His body was still alert, almost like he was waiting for permission to breathe. Crockett continued, this time addressing the crowd more than Barron. We've come to a place where youth voices are invited into the room, but only if they're agreeable. Only if they smile and nod and say, "Thank you for crumbs." That's not dialogue. That's theater. A few students near the back exchanged glances, not because they disagreed, but because they knew she was talking about them too. They'd seen that tightrope walk firsthand. Being heard meant being careful, measured, palatable. I want young people to speak. Crockett said, I want you to challenge me, but don't come at me with scripted punches. And expect me to flinch. You don't walk into the ring and expect your last name to do the fighting for you. A pause. Then she turned back to Barron. Not aggressively, but directly. I've buried friends. Because of failed systems you've been featured in. Magazines for being tall. The line landed not with applause, but with silence. The kind of silence that said people were listening too hard to even react. And still her voice never rose. Her words were steady, personal, unshaken. Her body language was a masterclass in control. Every gesture underscored the message. Every pause gave it space to breathe. Barron finally opened his mouth. I think I see your point, he said, though the words hung somewhere between admission and retreat. Crockett smiled, not smug, not dismissive, just a simple knowing smile like she'd heard enough to see a shift, even if it was small. You don't have to agree with me, she said, softening just slightly, but if you're going to be here really, here, bring something real. Not rehearsed at that moment. Even those who had walked into the event with a bias started to recalibrate. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It wasn't about party lines or parental legacies. It was about who had lived the weight of their words and who was borrowing them from others. Barron stood quietly for the first time that evening. He looked less like a speaker and more like a student. And Jasmine, she didn't gloat. She didn't take victory laps. She folded her hands on the table and waited for the next question. But something else was happening, while that silence hung in the air. Something that would carry far beyond that auditorium. It wasn't the volume of her voice. It was the weight of her memory. The moderator turned the conversation back to the panel, but the energy in the room hadn't returned to neutral. The crowd wasn't rowdy. They were locked-in heads, tilted forward, eyes darting between Crockett and Barron like a tennis match with no clear end. That's when Crockett, without being prompted, began to lay out her record. I wasn't always in Congress, she said, calm as ever. I wasn't born with a network or a stage. I spent 12 years representing people. No one ever wanted to hear from the room. Quieted again, she spoke about the case of Marcus Bellamy, an 8th grader suspended and criminally charged after pushing back when a school officer grabbed his backpack. They said he was being aggressive, she said. But what he was doing was trying to keep his notebook from being taken away. You know what was in it? Drawings, anime, stuff. A doodle of Sonic, the Hedgehog. She didn't rush the story. She gave it time to land. The system didn't care about context. He was labeled processed and made to feel disposable. At 13, his mother worked 2 jobs and slept in her car during the trial just to make his hearings. You want to talk about outrage? I'd love to see you try to whisper your way through that. No one interrupted her. Not the moderator, not Barron, not even the staffers sitting near the camera booth. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was something else. She kept going. There's this narrative, she said, that black women in politics are too emotional, too direct, that we're aggressive or performative. But here's the truth. You try surviving in rooms that weren't built for you, where being calm gets you ignored, and being direct gets you labeled. And then, tell me how much tone matters. She turned again, slightly, just enough to face Barron without locking him in. You came here with a strategy. You thought if you provoked me, I'd prove your point for you. But what you didn't count on was how much discipline it takes to hold fire without letting it burn the whole building down. Barron swallowed this time. Visibly, there was no smirk, no nod of acknowledgement, no clever one-liner waiting, just the quiet stillness of beginning to realize he brought a water pistol to a forest fire. Crockett leaned in again, just slightly. You want to lead? Then ask better questions. Not the kind that get you likes, but the kind that keep you up at night. Ask yourself who you're willing to lose votes, or ask what you'd risk your career for, and if the answer is nothing, then you're not ready. That line stuck, even. The older members of the audience, congressional aides, invited guests, retired teachers began to shift in their seats because what Crockett was doing wasn't a takedown. It wasn't revenge. It was mentorship delivered through truth that didn't sugarcoat. And it didn't end with Barron. She opened it up. I say this to every young person watching, not just the ones with famous last names. Don't waste your voice trying to sound important. Use it to say something important. She sat back. Then let the silence settle in again. The moderator looked stunned, not because he disagreed, but because moments like this weren't supposed to happen on live TV, not with time limits, pre-planned graphics, and commercial breaks queued up. But no one dared cut to an ad. Barron adjusted his mic again. He looked down briefly, then up. I didn't mean any disrespect. He said, voice lower. Now I thought. I was coming in prepared. I see. I missed something. Crockett didn't smirk. She didn't soften too much either. Then take that and grow. She said, the mic doesn't make you. Right listening? Might. But by the time the next panelist spoke, the internet had already decided whose voice carried louder. Even in a whisper, you could feel it. The tone had changed, not just between them, but across the entire room. What started as a tightly scripted forum had cracked open into something much messier, much more real. And Barron Trump, standing at the center of it, was no longer performing. He was processing. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved. Crockett's words didn't just land. They lingered. Her stories weren't abstract talking points. They were rooted in people, in memories, in systems that had names and paperwork and pain attached. There was no way to clap back at that with statistics or a pre-written retort. This wasn't a debate. This was experience standing toe-to-toe with assumption. Barron sat differently now. He was still upright, still composed, but the edge was gone. Gone was the stiffness in his shoulders. Gone was the cocky glint in his eye. In its place was something more tentative, something people in the room hadn't seen. From him, before humility, the moderator tried to regain control, shifting to the next question about digital privacy laws. But attention was fractured. Even the panelists struggled to redirect the weight of what had just happened was too heavy to sweep aside with a new topic across social media. Clips had already taken off. Not flashy ones either. The quiet exchanges, the pregnant pauses, Crocker saying, "The mic doesn't make you right." Barron's response, "I see, I missed something." Those fragments were spreading because they felt like something rare. Truth breaking through format. A producer backstage whispered into the moderator's earpiece. They were running long, but nobody wanted to cut. The moment the story had shifted, and as a person, not just a headline in waiting, he kept writing too. Somewhere in his notes was a line he circled twice. "Just because I didn't speak up before doesn't mean I was okay with it." That line said more than any press release could in a country where politics moves like a storm loud fast. Often senseless, this story lingered not because of the scandal itself, but because of the questions it forced people to ask: should children of the powerful be protected, or should they be accountable? Is silence protection or complicity? And who gets to draw that line? People didn't agree they weren't supposed to, but they were finally asking, and that might be the most honest place to start. Because at the end of the day, every name carries something. Some carry legacy, some carry shame, some carry nothing at all, but still get dragged along for the ride. But when you're born into power, even your silence speaks. And in Barron Trump's case, for once, he chose what that silence meant. If this story made you think, share it. If it made you question something you've